They were managed by Greek, Armenian, and Jewish community members, and they printed books in their own languages. So the Ottoman Empire was ruled by a Turkish dynasty that spoke Turkish, but you have a lot of different ethnic groups and language groups in the Ottoman Empire. Dozens, really, and you also have a lot of Jews who live there as well. So it was networks of people who would travel throughout the Mediterranean for trade, like Armenians and Jews and others, and it makes sense that they would encounter printing presses, take it back to their homelands in the Ottoman Empire, and set up newspapers or books there. Well, not really newspapers, they don't come till much later, but you do see books in these languages. In 1493, there was a Jewish print house in Thessaloniki. Armenians learned the printing press business in Italy and opened a print house in Istanbul in 1567, followed by the first Greek printing house in 1627. And the Sultan and the Ottoman leadership had no problem with this. The first thing that a Greek printing house printed was a booklet targeting the Jews. Sultan Murad III signed a firman, which is an official decree, in 1587, allowing the sale of books in Arabic, Farsi, and Turkish, which were published in Europe on Ottoman soil. So it doesn't seem like there's a problem with print shops in the beginning. So why didn't they spread in the Ottoman Empire? It seemed like Europe could very quickly understand the usefulness of these books. Well, the Turks didn't like books that were printed in printing houses, but they preferred handwritten books. Some thought that published books on printing presses lacked the art and grace of handwritten books. There was a whole infrastructure of calligraphy and those who did the art of calligraphy, and they thought that you couldn't reproduce the same thing. I mean, you have monks working in scriptoriums in the Middle Ages who do the same thing as well, but in the Ottoman Empire, it was on a whole other level. There were far more people involved in the production of handwritten books. And Ottoman intellectuals, who were also keen on aesthetics, enjoyed books written with elegant handwriting and whose ink shined, along with edges that were ornamented with golden gilt and covers that were made with care. There's all sorts of arguments why there are different aesthetic preferences in the Ottoman Empire versus Europe. Some think that the Islamic prohibition on depictions of Muhammad and perhaps a human form would make art stress more calligraphy, and that's why you see a lot more of these geometric patterns in mosques and other things. Not everyone accepts that theory, but that's at least one idea why calligraphy is so elevated and done to such a high technical style in the Islamic world. So reading books was not only a necessity, but also a pleasure. And there were plenty of calligraphy artists who copied plenty of books rapidly. These people could be out of a job. And on top of that, those who are keen on books belong to a certain class. You could have some issue where there's already an industry built up around it, and if we get back to our social construction of technology theory, a society like that just wouldn't value book production as much as one that didn't have a calligraphy class built up. Sort of like in cities today where taxis can lobby local city councils to make sure that Uber or Lyft don't come there because they have a whole industry built up around keeping a new innovation out. That could be a similar fact in the Ottoman Empire. So it's not a religious problem, it's an economics problem, and it's a special interest group problem. Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. Now, the first printing press that we know of, which originated among Muslims, or at least the first well-known case, was established by Ibrahim Müteferrika in 1727 during a reform period in the Ottoman Empire called the Tulip Period, where you have industrialization. You have more commerce with Europe. And it's called the Tulip Period because a lot of tulips are planted across Istanbul. It was opened 36 years later than the first printing press in New York, so this gives you an idea of the lag time. The project was commissioned by Said Effendi, an official who was taken to the Ottoman embassy in Paris as a clerk. He admired the printing presses in Paris, so upon his return, he assigned Ibrahim Müteferrika to establish a printing press similar to the one in Paris. Ibrahim Müteferrika wrote in the introduction of this work that many Islamic works were lost in Spain and other formerly Islamic areas because there weren't enough calligraphy artists to copy the books free of error, so he talked about the benefits of the printing press. He said, "The duplication of important books is useful for all. It helps the content of the books to spread. The writings are legible and are not affected by water. Printing is a profitable art. Thousands of books can be printed. While a volume of a book is written by hand, while only one volume of a book can be written by hand. This allows books to be cheaper. An index is added in the beginning and the end of the book, and one can find what he is looking for easily. It would be easy to access books in rural areas. Building libraries will support madrasas, which are Islamic schools. Hence, the number of people who study science will increase. It serves for the spread of Islam. Books in Arabic and Persian, which were published by the Europeans, as they have understood their importance, are filled with mistakes. These mistakes can be prevented. Printing presses augments the honor of the state. So Ibrahim Mutafarrikha, as a tradesman, is very pro-printing. But what about the religious class of the Ottoman Empire? What did they have to say about this? Well, the Shaykhul Islam, the top legal scholar of the Ottoman Empire, Abdullah Rumi Effendi, said this. He was asked this question. If a person, who claims to be an expert on the art of printing, says that he can make a mold of all letters and words of the books that are about lexicon, logic, philosophy, astronomy, and such non-religious books, and copy them by printing those molds on paper, will Islam allow him to copy books in this way? Upon this question, the scholar gave this answer. He gave a fatwa, which is sort of like a Supreme Court ruling. It's something that's going to guide other legal scholars in the future. And his answer was, those who are familiar with the art of printing produce many books in a very short time by making molds of letters and words and printing them on paper. Thus, they produce cheaper books. As it is useful, Islam allows these people to do that. A few people who know about the subject of the book should revise the book first. It would be good if the book is printed after reviewing it. Okay, so it sounds like there's no religious problem with printing books. Sounds like there's the technical ability to do it in the 1700s. But printing still doesn't take off. And the Grand Vizier, the chief advisor of the Sultan, liked Ibrahim Mutafarrikha's project. He received a firman, or an order, from Sultan Ahmed III in December 1727, allowing the printing of non-religious books. The first printing press was opened in a mansion on a pier in Istanbul, and 4 scholars were hired as proofreaders. The first book printed in 1727 was a 2-volume Arabic-Turkish lexicon titled Van Kulu. The first volume of the dictionary was over 600 pages long, while the second volume was over 700 pages long. 1,000 copies were then printed. Ibrahim Mutafarrikha then went on to print 2 maps and 21 volumes of books from the opening of the printing house until his death in 1745. And you still have a few copies of these books in places like the Istanbul University Public Library. Now, there's a story that calligraphy artists of the period placed their inkstands and pencils into coffins and walked to the palace of the Sultan to protest. So the writing of religious books was given to calligraphy artists alone following this incident. A European political figure, Baron de Tott, who was in Istanbul during this period, claims that the printing press was closed due to lack of interest. And this is the story that's been repeated to this day. But it could have been economic factors as well that could have shut down the nascent printing industry. The printing house of Ibrahim Mutafarrikha was closed for a short span of time because of a war with Russia, but it was reopened as soon as possible. About 70% of the printed inventory of Ibrahim Mutafarrikha was sold, so there was interest in printed books. When he died in 1745, his son-in-law and assistant, Ibrahim Effendi, took over the printing presses. Following the Russo-Turkish War, 2 other men, Rashid and Vasif Effendi, bought the printing press as soon as they heard that the French embassy wanted to buy it at a very high price in order to prevent the printing press to fall into the hands of foreigners. They even printed a book in French. In time, the printing press became old and the letters of the printing blocks became useless. The printing house that Ibrahim Mutafarrikha founded was closed in 1798. After this, the state founded 3 different printing presses to publish official state documents. Later in the 1800s, Sultan Mahmud allowed religious books to be printed by printing presses. So that's the general overview of the story. Now, I will drill down a little bit more into the argument about whether printing presses should be adopted, but I want to mention just one thing here. Something that is left out in this whole discussion is the technological challenges of printing in different languages. The Latin alphabet is pretty easy from a technical standpoint to print in. You have 26 letters, lowercase, and then 26 more uppercase. You have some punctuation marks. It's pretty simple when it comes to movable type. But when you get into other languages, it becomes more challenging. The way that the Arabic alphabet goes, and it's kind of hard to crunch this down into a very short explanation, But in the Arabic alphabet, the way a letter looks changes depending on where it is in a word. If it's at the beginning of a word, it looks one way. If it's in the middle, it looks another way. If it's at the end, it looks a third way. So for every letter, you need at least 3 different forms. With all the letters in the Arabic alphabet, this is a lot of different ligatures and a lot of different pieces that you need on movable type. So it's a few times more difficult to print in the Arabic alphabet as it is in the Latin alphabet. Also, you need a sort of industrial infrastructure to go along your printing presses. You couldn't just drop a printing press into a jungle and start making newspapers. You need to have a total industrial system. With later technological changes that come to printing presses later in the 1700s, 1800s, it becomes much easier to print in the Arabic alphabet. But just the way that letters are constructed, it's easier in Latin than it is in Arabic, so that's one factor as well. If they were both absolutely the same, the Arabic and the Latin alphabets, or if the Turkish language used the Latin alphabet as it does today, I argue that the printing press would have come a lot earlier. So that's another point to keep in mind here, that the technological challenges are different. Now, I want to dig more into the argument that due to religious reasons, the printing press was banned in the Ottoman Empire in the Muslim world and only came about later. This claim comes from the French Franciscan priest, André Thevet, who lived from 1502 to 1590. Thevet wrote about statements and orders from the Sultan, called firmans, in the second volume of his 8-volume work entitled The True Portraits and Lives of Illustrious Greek, Latin, and Pagan Men. This was printed in Paris in 1584, and the book comprises chapters on distinguished historical figures. In Thevet's chapter on Johannes Gutenberg, inventor of printing, he compared the invention and adoption of printing in Europe to the absence of the technology in the East. And this account comes from an article by Catherine Schwartz called Did Ottoman Sultans Ban Print? You can look at that article for more information about this. Anyway, here's what Thevet says. What I know for sure is that the Greeks, Armenians, Abyssinians, Turks, Persians, Moors, Arabs, and Tartars do not write their books except by hand, and that among the others, the Turks are constrained by the ordinance of their emperor, Bayazid II, published in the year 1483, carrying the prohibitions on the pain of death to not consume printed books, which was the ordinance confirmed by Selim, first of name, or Selim I, another sultan, his son, in the year 1515. So this French scholar is saying that the Ottomans banned the printing and the consumption of printed books on pain of death. But there's good reasons to think that Thevet is not a reliable witness. Other early modern European reports contradict his claim. Count Luigi Fernando Marsigli, who lived from 1658 to 1730, challenged the notion that the sultans banned printing. He had first-hand dealings with the Ottomans for 20 years from the 1680s onward. He traveled in the empire, battled against it in service of the Habsburgs, and lived among Ottoman janissaries as a prisoner of war. In his book on the Ottoman military, he refuted the notion of the Ottoman printing ban. He said, "The Turks, it is true, do not print their books at all. But this is not, as is commonly believed, because they are prohibited to print, or because their books are unworthy of printing." So his statement should carry weight because Marsigli was fluent in Ottoman Turkish. And he also amassed more than 600 manuscripts during his travels. Beyond that, Marsigli was himself a printer who worked with Medici Oriental typefaces at the press he established in Bologna. He said that the Turks never print their works, but this is not, as is believed commonly, because printing is banned or because their works are not worth printing. They do not wish to prevent so many copyists, to the number of 86,000 when I was at Constantinople, from earning a living, and it is this that the Turks have said themselves to Christians and to Jews who wish to introduce printing to the empire to make a profit. So there was simply too much of a vested interest. To give a modern-day example of what this could look like, I lived in Istanbul for a number of years. Uber has tried to break into Istanbul, but there are so many taxi drivers in the city, and they charge cheaply, and you really wouldn't save any money with Uber, that people don't bother taking Uber, even though it's cool and more technologically advanced than taxis. It doesn't meet any need that's already being met, so they're not making any inroads there because the traditional industry is doing it just fine. So we could say that traditional copying and handwriting was meeting the need of readable materials just fine in Istanbul. Now let's look at these sultanic edicts themselves and see what was actually going on here. Murad III, a sultan from 1574 to 1599, issued the first firman